All right, and now please welcome Mrs. Kate Washington from Central State University. Really excited to have Steve. He's very knowledgeable, and I know he's gonna educate us well today. So thanks for being here, Steve.
Welcome everyone, and thanks, Gerard. And she's not a very good liar. She said I was knowledgeable. Don't why she trying to be funny this morning. I guess because it's a Friday, why not have but she is correct. My name is Steve Washington. I'm an extension educator for community and economic development with Central State University's Land Grant Extension, which is located in Wilberforce, Ohio. And Central State is one of two land grant universities in the state of Ohio, the other being the Ohio State University. Congratulations on the national championship. Buckeye too. So ourselves and Ohio State are the two land grant universities, which are USDA designated institutions. We're an 1890 land grant, meaning the year 1890, which is when that designation was created for what we now know as HBCUs. And so we're one of 19 HBCUs across the country that are designated land grant universities, which is a real blessing for the state of Ohio to have these land grant resources, be able to go out to the agricultural community, both rural and urban. And so we bring that programming and support that. And with that, I have several of my colleagues in the room, the entire team, and I would be remiss not to recognize them from our community and economic development team, where we do financial literacy, small ag business startup training, and now we've added Heirs property to our platform of workshops and education we provide. We have Ms. Rhonda Saunders, who represents our Trumbull, Warren, Youngstown area. We have Ms. Vanetta Perry, who represents us in Cuyahoga County. We have Ms. Lisa Lawrence, who represents us in Northwest Ohio in the Toledo area. We have Mr. Kunta Jackson, who represents us in Montgomery County. We have Ms. Camille Smith, who represents us also in Montgomery County. We have Amber Twitty, who represents us in Southwest Ohio in the Cincinnati area, and Portsmouth. She's got the whole, a lot of counties. We're in 44 of the 88 counties, so we're getting there. We have Marcia Coleman, who also represents us in Cuyahoga County, more so the western part. And we have Eric Smith that represents us in the Lima, Mansfield, greater area, and also helps out the team statewide. So we have almost our whole community economic development team with us personally. I've been with the university 12 years. Prior to joining Extension, I was on the full-time faculty teaching finance and economics. I won't go back beyond there because that would be like 50 years worth of stuff. We don't have time. But we're here to talk about understanding heirs property at the community level. And this is just an overview of this subject, which is a very urgent subject in a lot of parts of the country. It gets a lot of attention in the Southeast because there's a lot of heirs property issues there, but we have them in Ohio too. Ohio has an estimated 9,000 heirs properties currently, and we'll talk about that and what that means. And Gerard, next slide, please. Thanks. So our team has received training regarding heirs property from the Southern Rural Development Center, SDRC, which has done extensive work on the subject and created. Oh, someone's back. It's okay, I can talk over it. So the SDRC, the Southern Rural Development Center, which is part of the land grant system nationally, has developed the curriculum around this subject. And the Southern Extension Risk Management Education Center, along with Alcorn State University, which is another 1890 land grant. They provide these trainings nationally, and extension professionals and others, because I believe Jara said she's had that training too, have been trained. And so we're bringing this to Ohio. I wouldn't say for the first time, but we're going to illuminate it a little more than probably it has been in the past. Yep, next slide. So I just wanted to acknowledge the original authors of a lot of the work you're going to see. So there they are. And again, I'm Steve Washington. I'm an extension educator in Northeast Ohio for community and economic development for Central State University Extension. And there's my contact information, but I also have business cards for old people who still use those. And for young people, there's a QR code in the back, and you can just scan that and be on your way. And I can keep my cards if that's what you'd rather do. So this is an overview because the subject matter, we could probably break this up into 3 or 4 or 5 sessions, but this is going to be just a basic overview of the situation. And we're just going to go over exactly what is heirs property, because it's sort of a weird name for a simple concept. And then what are the impacts, legal and cultural considerations, what is meant by fractional ownership, how to actually locate heirs property, and then the resulting land loss that happens because of and how to prevent that. So what is heirs property? And this is really, as we go through this, what you'll see is this is basically estate planning for property. That's really what this is about. Estate planning, but specifically for real property, because unlike grandma's jewelry collection, that might not have been properly willed. That's not in the public domain, so no one's going to come and take grandma's jewelry. You'll just have to, the family will just eventually decide how to divide it up, right? But property is in the public domain. There are property taxes attached to it, and so it's a little bit more complicated than that. How you doing, Ms. Trotter? So heirs property is inherited property. Heirs inherit, you've inherited property. If it hasn't been really well willed and documented, then it can cause problems. And sometimes just having a will, theoretically, that's not enough when it comes to property. So property passed down informally from generation to generation, known as fractured, tangled, and clouded. You may be in your own mind thinking, I know of a situation like this, or I've heard of where this happened to people. And so now typically we think about this in terms of how it affects rural farmland, but it could just be a house on a regular lot, or it could just be a lot with nothing on it. So it's, state laws are pivotal into how this is handled, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But this can end up with multiple future generations technically having a claim on real property, and no good way to divide it up after it's gone too long. And usually it ends up being lost to the family. Next slide. So, each heir has, if it's undocumented or informally passed down, and again, even in a will, it can be informal if it's not specific enough. So if the will is, I leave, the farm to my kids, that seems like, well, it's in the will, but that's probably not
definitely not specific enough. So there's the taxation responsibility and other property-related expenses that come into play here. So sometimes this property can transfer by gift or sale. It could be an heir or non-heir. So the physical, the issue is how's the physical distribution of the property going to occur if a really good estate plan hasn't been built. So we hear these terms, so property without clear title, family land, clouded, fractured, tangled. All of these terms, can apply to, an heirs property situation. Slide. So when there's not a clear title, meaning clarity of ownership, then we get into, an heirs property situation. We get into probate. We get into who's responsible for paying the taxes. Get into if the taxes haven't been paid, now what happens, right? So you end up with tax liens. I have a situation with a client we're working with in Akron, Ohio, where the gentleman, his father died, and he willed him the property, but the lots, he paid taxes on some of the lots, not all the lots. So now a majority of the property has been land banked with delinquent taxes, and so now it's just a huge, mess, and he's unable to pay those taxes. So he has some of the land in clear title, and the rest of it has essentially been taken by the county. Yes, sir. Property taxes. Yep, property taxes. And of course, this is public record. You can just look it up, and that's what people do. And then they are able to secure a property that way. Yes, ma'am. So most counties or cities have a land bank, which is usually a public nonprofit that through their agreements with the government are able to assume land where property taxes have not been paid over a period of time and they become delinquent. Yep. So if you do not decide how you want your estate divided, the state where you locate will decide for you. And I think most people are aware of that, what happens if you have an inheritance that hasn't been properly willed and it ends up in probate court. And so now state law takes over. But of course, again, when the assets are actual real property, then that's more complicated because of the taxes and other issues that could be involved. And obviously, property, real estate is finite. So eventually it's going to end up in the hands of someone, unlike grandma's jewelry, which it just never gets divided and no one knows or cares, right? So I think we're all aware of that. Next slide. So the question is, what are the impacts of heirs property? Heirs property specifically being property informally passed down to heirs, to descendants of a deceased individual. Next slide. So the impacts are many, but the main ones, there's obviously an impact on personal assets. If you lose property, you start talking about net worth and, generational wealth. Family decision-making, there's an impact because a lot of times, and I've seen this with a friend who has property, a family situation in Mississippi where some of the family just wants to sell it, others want to keep it and move on to it, and then how do you figure that out? And then on community development, because when that land is tied up, it's hard to use it for productive use, whether that's for agricultural use, other uses, development purposes, what have you. So, the landowner has impact because if the property is tied up as heirs property, a lot of times the property, and we've seen this a lot in the South, where the properties have timber that could be harvested, used, replanted. That can't move forward if you're tied up. Obviously, if it's a farm, it's hard to do the farming and the harvesting. There could be mineral rights. Sometimes there's mortgages still on the land too, right? It's not necessarily free and clear. So in addition to taxes, is there an unpaid mortgage balance? How does that figure into it? Who's going to pay it? How do you figure that out within the context of the estate plan? Very difficult to access USDA programming or conservation easements, you know, if the property is tied up as heirs property and unresolved. So there are negative impacts for that planning not having been properly done. Next slide. Thank you. So obviously there's a huge impact on family assets and net worth. When you talk about issues like intergenerational wealth, intergenerational poverty, in some cases, you know, these are huge impacts. Now, a lot of this work down south was done around large amounts of land, especially in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, where African-American families had land from the turn of the century that was farmed. And then you had what was known as the Great Negro Migration. People moved up north. And then all of a sudden, what about that huge farm great-granddad had? Oh, we forgot about that. You know, so it gets lost because there's almost no, shouldn't say there's no efficient way, but if you've got a lot of family members spread out across the country with different interests, you have people who've never even been to Mississippi, so they have no interest in keeping it, others want it. So, but it's, you know, net worth and intergenerational wealth can be extremely hindered by that. And so you have other issues. So the land can't really be used. You can't borrow against it. It's hard, you can't get it insured. You can't deal with the US. There's a lot of impediments. But eventually the land becomes lost and it becomes a lost asset to the family. Yes.
Could you explain a little bit about how this situation can impact someone who is actually on the land and living there or farming there?
Yeah. Yeah, they can lose the land and be forced off of it. And that happens a lot when especially when there's a disagreement. Like I know of a personal situation with a friend where this is in Mississippi, where there are relatives living on the land, and then there's other land where people are in Chicago and Cleveland, they have no interest in it at all. And it's sort of a difficult situation to figure out, you know, what to do with the land. But yeah, eventually, if the issues aren't resolved, especially if taxes haven't been paid, then eventually you're going to be moved, that land is going to be bought up from underneath you. Yes, Amber.
It's not just land, it's actually, you have a barn out, you know, a barn, if you have a house on any of that property, and then it gets dilapidated because you can't get mortgage or anything to bring it up to code. So you can't do anything, but you can't get USDA resources until this is resolved. And so people can come in through auction and other types of sales, and then they just show up on the doorstep of someone living on the property and say, you got 30 days to get out because I now own your property, and they didn't know what was going on. So that is another big risk.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because in Ohio, there's an estimated 9,000 heirs properties, but they're primarily single family homes for the most part. Ohio doesn't have the same pervasive rural property heirs property situation that you see in the South. But the state of West Virginia, our bordering state, is the second highest heirs property state in the country. It's like, it's full of heirs property. They've got like close to 40,000 heirs properties, mostly rural. And it's just really just lack of education and estate planning. It's also it's a state for another reason they have a state with a low frequency of wills, a high frequency of people dying intestate, meaning without a will. So that's why they have that. But in Ohio, it's mostly urban single-family homes or near urban single-family homes. Same thing. Then you can't remortgage it, you can't sell it, you can fix it, but you can't borrow any money to fix it. Next thing you know, it's gone. And those are actually easier to be gone than like a whole farm. Mm-hmm.
Previous screen, challenges to get it.
Well, if you don't have clear title, you can't get a farm number. Basically, that's it. That's about the only thing required to get a farm number is somebody owns it, clear, legally, clear ownership. Yep. So it sort of cuts you out of all that. Now, if it's an urban city property, that's probably not your concern. But obviously, if it is a farm, it can be because you're right, because you can't get a farm number even when you want to do an urban farm on a blank lot. It could just be a lot, right? So you're right, and so I don't believe that's true, but I think that participating in USDA farm programs when you don't really even have who owns the land, that's just difficult.
You don't have site control.
Yeah, you don't have site control.
Whether that's lease or.
Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to talk about that, but pay the taxes. But then, then there's probate court, right? So it depends on if it's just you inherited, a parent didn't have a good will or a will at all, and it's a property that you could probably get figured out pretty easy. But if you're the grandchild of someone who had property and you got like 5 aunts and uncles and then 20 first cousins, that's when it gets difficult. So time has a lot to do with it, so when this stuff happens, if someone passes away intestate without a proper will, the sooner the situation gets addressed, the better, because if babies keep getting born and generations keep passing, now it becomes untenable. You got to hire a lawyer. You might not even be worth what you got to pay the lawyer to figure it out to even do it. That's why it ends up being taken. Yes.
And I'm probably going to get to this, but how difficult it is when we talk about getting everyone on the same page. And he had mentioned something about the generations that have passed, time that has passed. And you talk about your uncles, cousins, sisters, brothers, and all that stuff. All those people that have to be on the same page. And you mentioned about what it's going to take to get that clear title. I'm sure we can't even in this room agree on what we're going to eat for lunch. If we had to say, get everybody on the same page to have pizza, and somebody's going to say, well, I want pizza with cheese, I want pizza, so that's what we're talking about here. And I'm sure we're probably going to get into it, but I just kind of wanted to piggyback on what you're saying.
Of a situation where the family formed a committee, they have conference calls, it becomes like a business, you got to almost like a business to because that's to get everybody on the same page, get a lawyer, figure out, okay, we got to pay this lawyer. Who's going to pay this lawyer? So, in addition to everything else. Yep, next slide, thanks. So, we have all this. So there's all sorts of negative impacts on the community from land management to development to obviously if taxes aren't being paid, those are resources lost to the local community, and just the, being able to improve the property, keep it up, and it can affect other local properties where you have unresolved property issues, whether it's a house next to you that is falling apart because it's lost in an heirs property situation. Yep. Next slide. So I think we got a good overview of what we're talking about here. So we'll continue. So from a legal standpoint and from a cultural standpoint, let's dig into that a little bit. So to prevent the problems associated with heirs property, all you need is a will, yes or no? Yeah, usually not. You really want an estate. I think we probably already knew the answer to that from what we already talked about. You really want a real estate plan with real specifics about the property. You might not have to get real specific about who gets the big screen TV, but you need to be real specific about the property in terms of, is there still a mortgage attached to it? What about the insurance? Are the taxes paid up? Specifically, who is heir to this property, as specific as possible, especially if there are, quote, multiple lots involved, like exactly who, or else it can get tied up. So we really want, which is why this is really all about estate planning. Next slide. So, if the will is properly executed and specific and according to state law, then a will can be enough. It just depends on the specifics, but that's not the only way. And really, a complete estate plan where really all the assets are very specifically laid out is the best route. Now, states are different. Some states have some legal protections around heirs property, which we'll look at. Ohio isn't one of them, by the way. Probably because of the relatively low incidence of rural heirs property cases, that's probably why we don't. And we're actually a low heirs property state compared to others like Mississippi, West Virginia, Alabama, Louisiana. So obviously the biggest issue is lack of knowledge about wills and estate planning. And so that's why you would say, why would a small state like West Virginia have so much heirs property? It's really just education. You got a high incidence of people passing away without any type of will whatsoever. Now, when it gets deep and crazy and you got to bring an attorney in, that's a big impediment, A, because they're expensive, and not the average attorney walking down the street is an expert in heirs property. So you got to find a specialist who might charge a little bit more than your average attorney walking down the street, right? So that gets into it, especially as time goes. And then you have just lack of knowledge, mistrust. Some people think that the legal system is going to take the land, which it will if you don't address it. So these are the major barriers. Yep. So, when you're talking about land, you have various attitudes. Some family members might look at it as, this is a family legacy. This shouldn't be sold. Some think it should. A big impediment to estate planning and wills is just nobody wants to talk about death, right? Like I wrote has anybody written a will? Oh man, I need more hands up than that. Writing a will is like a weird experience. It's like, it's weird. I can see, you can get in the middle of it and want to stop because it's like, wow, I'm actually going to be dead one day. Or how do you go to somebody else and say, Dad, by the way, Mom? So that's how a lot of it goes by the wayside. Or I'll do it, but I'm just gonna do it bare minimum. I leave everything to my kids. Okay, well done. Yeah. Right. Yeah, nobody wants to bring that up, right? So the taboo of death talk. So, there's a lot of cultural considerations, and I think that's why you see a lot of heirs property situations in certain parts of the country where it's just a taboo subject, there's lack of education, lack of clarity. It could be religious issues involved, what have you. Next.
People just don't want to talk about that final thing of death, so they don't want to talk about it.
Right, especially in deep detail. Not people want to generalize a will just to hurry up and do it. I don't really think about this, but the detail that you really should have when it comes to the real estate is important. So now one of the big barriers, and we talked about this, is if it gets generational, distance becomes a big issue. Point in fact, my friend who has the issue in Mississippi, because people are all over the country. Some people in the family have never even been to Mississippi, don't want to go. So what happens is there's a big disagreement. Should it be sold? Should it be used for development? Should it be used for agriculture? Should we rent the place out? Does somebody want to live on it? Younger generations might have no interest in that, where older generations think it's a valuable family legacy that they want to go retire on the property, what have you. That's why the better the will, and then the sooner things are taken care of, the easier, the better it becomes. So once it gets generational, it's difficult. Yep. So fractional ownership, which is self-explanatory, meaning it's divided up into fractions, into pieces, sometimes little bitty pieces, unmanageable pieces, unresolvable pieces, basically based on the amount of time, the distance that relatives have moved away, and then people's general knowledge of estate planning. So, sometimes things aren't necessarily going to be evenly divided. It depends on where you lie in the generation and who's still alive, right? So it's not like everything is just split up symmetrically, because the kids and then the grandchildren and how that's going to work and how many kids and who's still alive, and what if one of the aunts or uncles have passed and we still not reserved. Now, who gets that? Who doesn't want it? Do we even know where everybody is in the country? Who's all eligible, right? So you could get into a situation that looks like this, and now we've got a lot of problems because there could be unpaid taxes, there could be dilapidation that's occurred, there could be any number of issues that have occurred. There's distance, right? And so across generations, it makes it complicated. So for example, and they used this example in the material they gave us, if in 1865, a family acquired 40 acres and had 4 children, then this is what the division of property would look like at that time, right? But if we fast forward, next slide, over time, and I think maybe that's not all fitting. So, from 1865 to 2020, you could go from 4 heirs to 65,000 heirs, right? And so that's a long time period, but what it shows is that the number of heirs can multiply quickly just from over a couple generations, just from two. You could go from 4 to 64, or just in 3 generations. Now it becomes unresolved. Things become unresolvable, and you're like, well, how often does that happen? It happens quite a bit, especially in the Southeast. Right, so all of a sudden, everybody owns about 26,000 square feet. So distance can lead to disinterest. Distance can lead to disinterest. And if there's disinterest, then it's difficult to resolve because it takes a lot of work and attention. It's going to probably take some money to get it resolved. And so what happens is eventually it's not resolved and the land is lost to speculators, to other investors.
Wanted to understand how you got that type of situation. You pay jointly or separately?
Good question. Either way, because the county doesn't really care, they just want the check. So that's one of the issues. Like, who's going to pay the taxes, and who owes what? Right, and then a lot of times you have heirs where they're like, "Wait a minute, I'm the one who's been paying the taxes. What do you mean all of you guys want a piece? This is mine." No, it's not that simple, because the county is like, it doesn't work that way. You can't claim ownership of all the properties just because you were the heir that paid all the taxes.
People move in if it's generational, you have to contact only just the children, or do they have to go to the next children before they say, hey, because I know, I just started doing my family tree, but I know that there's been land that they said that they reached out, and I can see the thing online and say, hey, but it's like, there was no way to reach out to these people, but one, my grandfather was passed, and my grandmother was in another location. So, and her children never got, so how do we hold the system accountable to following this, say, guideline? Or
The system isn't going to, you have to do it. The system isn't going to do it. Go ahead, Aaron. Yeah, that's the issue.
because that's something you as an individual or family can do instead of paying a lawyer to do it and paying them tens of thousands of dollars. That's something that you can take ownership of. And then another thing is you can, as a family, say, we're gonna designate this person or persons in our family to make those management decisions. So that's how you can kind of narrow down and regain control of the process.
Yep. And
Where the taxes or the deceased, what's the statute for them to come in and say, hey, okay, now we're taking it back?
statute of limitation. You mean, how long does it take before the property can be, well, once you go in? Yeah. So, there is a process, because it depends on the state and the county, how it works, right? But if you go in and for example, I know in Akron, you go in and you pay the taxes, I think people have a year to pay those, to come in and essentially pay you back. And if not, then you can proceed legally with the process of, it's not all of a sudden it's yours the next day, but then there's a process. So they have a year to pay the county to make that payment.
Well, I'm saying, if I'm the state and I'm gonna take your property now because you haven't paid, how much time do I have before, I have a year before I can say, I own it now?
And so I think that would be a case by case research, but there's a time frame.
It's gonna vary by county.
Yeah.
County is assessing taxes.
Okay, got it.
And in my part of Cuyahoga County, there is abandoned property for years and years and years. I mean, literally 10, 12 years. That property is, in diminished value. Every year it becomes a neighborhood eyesore. And
the protections that are built into the system make it hard for the sheriff to actually come and sign that property.
Yeah.
It will happen eventually, but.
It will happen eventually.
So one of the things is contacting like school or any of the educators who had a certification. The Heirs is an Heirs property kind of network. And in that network, they have included lawyers that help navigate that. So contacting us, we're not the legal piece of it. We can't give legal advice, but we can connect you so that, our role is to make connections for you so that you can keep moving forward.
Yeah, the SDRC, good point. The SDRC, the organization to put this together, yeah, they do have experts, lawyers, people who can help, yeah, and answer specific questions. Yep.
I
Yep.
think the biggest thing is that, like I say, find that attorney to kind of stop that process, slow process. If you think you are entitled, somewhat, some way, or you have, built that system or that network or that, I guess, spokesperson of the heirs to talk to the attorney. And of course, you gotta keep on paying them. If you don't pay them, then, it's, not important.
Yeah, a lot of times the cost ends up being the big hurdle. Because some family members have money, some don't, Next slide. So management challenges, just meaning, the land, especially if it's farmland or some land that can be productive, over time, heirs don't live near the land or each other, sometimes don't even know each other, right? So you might have to get on ancestry.com, point in fact, just to figure out who in the family. It's not like all of your extended cousins, maybe. How do you locate these people, right? Where are they? And then if no one has a connection to the land, that's sort of a recipe for losing it, right? Next. So locating heirs property, because you may have heirs property and not know it. So next. So typically, if you're like, is there heirs property in my region, in my county? What about in my family? Yep, next. So in Ohio, so this is giving you an idea because a lot of this work has been done in the Southeast. Now in Ohio, I did the research. Right now, they estimate about 9,000. But you can see, and these are per counties, you can sort of look at like the state of Mississippi, and if you look at West Virginia, but really a lot of the Southeast has a lot of heirs property. Most of it is lack of education and just estate planning related. So what about my county? So now at the county level, next slide. So here's an example of a county in Alabama. And so at the county level, it's really a matter of, anyone can go in and figure out if there are distressed properties where the taxes haven't been paid. There's vacant lots that have been around forever. And really that's a county level. And so if you're wondering, like, I wonder if I can find out if there are any heirs properties in my county. Yeah, you can go in and do the work. And most of it can be done over the internet nowadays, but you can find out what's tax delinquent and get an idea of if there are properties. The land bank, your local land bank is another good place because they'll have properties that are banked in their system. A lot of times those are as a result of an heirs property situation. Next slide. And what about in my family? Like I said, you could actually have heirs property and not know it. So in most counties, to some degree or another, you can go online and by tapping in your family name or various names that that are within your family, maiden or otherwise, you can figure out if there's some heirs property. I mean, a lot of times it might be in a state or a county that you've never even lived in, but you're like, yeah, my grandparents were raised in wherever. I wonder if we got property down there still. And people find that all the time, where they actually figure out, wow, we got some tied up property. Yep, next slide. Because heirs property is land without a secured title, it is often the target of predatory strategies, legal strategies, which there are people, that's what they do. They look up, they try to find out if there's a family that's slipped up and there's some property available, especially if it has a productive capacity. So when farmland falls into this, the predators are all over, because farmland is very valuable. If you mess around and let a farm fall into this, someone's going to figure it out and get it. If it's a dilapidated property in the low income part of the city, that might take longer, because now it's something that might not be as desirable.
So this process, like someone trying to get your land or like losing your land as a result of the property, that doesn't really get initiated until there's an interest in that property?
Nope. It can get initiated as soon as it's been improperly willed. Then you've got an heirs property situation. You mean in terms of someone trying to get it? Well, I mean, as soon as it becomes public record that this property might be an heirs property situation, usually by taxes, or it could be foreclosed on, what have you. If there was a mortgage involved, then it can attract predators. It's public information. So the typical way that the land is eventually lost is either through a tax sale, because the taxes haven't been paid, and so it becomes available that way. And then partition sales, where pieces of it are picked off, like the situation with a guy I have up in Akron, where he paid taxes on some of it, but not all of it. So he already lost it to the Summit County Land Bank already, because it's being partitioned. So, all counties, any county, you can look this up. There are I look them up in Summit County all the time. They do tax lien sales every month. And you can just go online and you can look, and they'll tell you exactly what the taxes are that are owed, the opening bid. And if you get it, I think you got 2 weeks to actually come up with the rest of the money once you put down the deposit, da-da-da-da-da-da. So these tax lien-based auctions, which are county-based, and each county will sort of have its own way, but it's the same concept. So yeah, I look at those, because sometimes, yeah, I've looked at, there's some nice deals out there. Now, a lot of times the property, though, hasn't been kept up. So it's not like you're moving in, but stuff's out there. So partition sale, one or more of the co-owners of the property sell fractional interest to an entity like a developer. So now, so these developers, especially down south, they'll come in and they'll buy a partition. And a lot of times they'll do that to force the rest of the family just to sell the rest. Yep. So the result, family loses the land. So now there is what's known as the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act that has been adopted by states. Ohio is not one of the states that has adopted the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, probably because it's considered a low heirs property state in terms of rural heirs property. It's probably why. Yep. And so what that does is, so the legislature can adopt it, and it creates procedures for heirs property owners when a partition action is filed, meaning when someone tries to buy piece or buy a piece of the property away, really trying to eventually get it all. So you have some rights to protect you from losing the land if this is done. So as of May 2024, you can see the states that have adopted or introduced this, and you can see Ohio is one of the states that have not. And interestingly enough, neither has West Virginia, even though it's a super high heirs property state. I find that interesting that they have not done that. But so there are some protections and some procedures. Doesn't mean you can't still lose the land, but at least there's some legal procedures that can help families keep the land if your state has done it. So it just, it enhances notice. It requires independent appraisals. A big one, right of first refusal, meaning the family has to have the first shot of putting together a plan of acquiring the land before someone can come in and take it. Preference for partition in kind, meaning there can be other ways of acquiring a partition or have the land donated. If the family wants to, they can ask that it just be an open market sale as opposed to a partitioning creditor. So partition in kind, meaning dividing the land into pieces of equal value so that it can be properly sold that way, because sometimes the land the lots haven't been partitioned properly. Yep.
I've heard about people having, would this help if people get landlocked, like you can't get to the parcel of land that you still own because they sold off a parcel that's like access, so you got the same thing used?
Yep, it could be, yep. It protects you from that, yep. Yep, that can protect from that. Right. Right, we have to to break up the parcels into equal value pieces, yep. As opposed to, yeah, they bought the land access. So now we might as well sell the rest because we can't use it anyway. So this act only applies to heirs property. It doesn't apply to any other sort of asset. And so it basically, in states where this is in play, it helps families keep the land if somebody moves on it. But it doesn't get you out of the taxes, doesn't get you out of paying for an attorney. It just creates a legal framework to try to keep the land. Yep. So I'm sure everybody understands why heirs property is an important issue. Hopefully something got you fired up, like you want to go run through a wall for some heirs property. Anything about this you wish you had more information on? So there's a lot of public information on this subject, so it's an easy thing to self-educate, but it does come down to your county and locally how things, what's set up, and your state if you have